Hi, welcome to Sewing with Sandy, and today we're going to talk about finishing the neck edges of our garment with bias binding. There's a couple of different options. There's lots of different options to use to finish your neck edge, but when you use a bias binding, either a contrasting or a self fabric one, you're going to notice that what you come up with is a garment that looks more high-end retail, better finished, less homemade, more like something that you would purchase in the store. And after all, that is really our goal. Our goal is to make garments that look just like we've purchased them at a high-end retail store. So we're going to explore a couple of different options. Before we get started with that, I want to tell you this shirt. This is the Teddy designer top from Style Arc. And I'll put a link in the bottom to where you can see a review on this pattern. I made it a bunch of times. It's super cute and very comfy. It has a facing, but I just wanted to mention that shirt. Also, one of the shirts we're going to be working with today is the Rio Ringer t-shirt and dress. And this is from True Bias. And on this one, it's ribbing. I made it with the ribbing and it looks amazing, but I've also made it with a self fabric bias, so the fabric is the same as the rest of the garment, so it blends in. So these are two really nice patterns, but this one particularly, if you're looking for a cute little t-shirt and you want to finish it off with the neck edge with a self binding. This little gem right here has a contrasting neck edge because the stripes would have been like way too crazy and too much. So this is fold over elastic. And fold over elastic comes in a bunch of different colors. I'll add some sources to the bottom where you can get this. But essentially it's elastic and you can buy it by the yard. So I have a big bag of gray here. And there is a groove in the middle of it. And what you do is fold it over. Hence the name, fold over elastic. And what that does is it captures either side of your fabric edge. So you fold it over and then you stitch it. And that takes some talent. You need to kind of stretch it as you go along and make sure that it's covering both ends of the garment and you're catching it in your stitches. So this is something that you need to practice on, and certainly you can accomplish it. It just takes a little time to make it look neat. But it's a great, easy fix, and it comes in lots of different colors. I keep black and gray on hand all the time because it's a quick way to finish off a neck edge and give you a little contrast at the same time, right? So let's talk a little bit about why we use bias binding and why we want to finish our neck edges this way. One of the things you can see on this Judy is that this is nice and smooth against the neck edge. It's not sticking out, it's not ruffly, it's hugging close to the body, and that's what we want when we're with knits. We want something that's hugging close to the body, and we want something that's going to kind of take it in. So when you add a bias binding to a neck edge, you need to shrink it by a certain amount. I usually measure the neck edge and then I cut my bias binding about 1 inch or 1.5 inches, depending. This is a big neck edge. For a small neck edge, 1 inch smaller, because what you want to do is you want to stretch the bias binding so it holds that knit in. If you've ever made a 1-to-1 binding around the neck edge and it's waffly, that's why, because there's too much binding and it's very stretchy. There's too much bias binding for the garment itself. So let's talk about bias. Square fabric. It's cut on the straight of the grain, so there's no stretch. It's cotton. It's 100% cotton. It's quilting cotton. So there's no stretch going across the grain, and there's no stretch on the lengthwise grain. But when we talk about bias, we're talking about bisecting those two grains. And what happens is you have this really great stretch. So that's how we want to cut. Our bias is on a 45-degree angle. And I'm going to show you how to do that right now. All right, so I have this massive mat here, cutting mat, and it has all kinds of grid lines on it, which is perfect because that helps me get my fabric lined up nice and straight. So I have squared off this edge, so I know that this is square and this is the selvage, so this is straight. I know that. And then this does not have a lot of stretch and this does not have a lot of stretch, but if I go at a 45-degree angle this is what I'm looking for. I'm looking for that beautiful stretch. And I have my handy dandy rotary cutter. And then I also have a ruler. And this ruler, it's hard to see because it's very beat up. You can see I've used it for years. This ruler has a 45-degree angle line on it. So I have this 45-degree line here on my ruler. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to line the 45-degree line of my ruler up against the edge of my fabric. And what that gives me is a 45-degree line, a cut line. So it's the perfect place to start. You can start with a small corner. And it cuts off a triangle, but you can see that that is stretchy. So now I have my 45-degree cut line, and I know that's good, and it's straight and it's square. And say I want to make a piece of 2-inch binding. What I'm going to do is use the grid on my ruler that has 2 inches. So I'm going to line that 2-inch line up against my 45-degree cut line, and I am going to cut a strip of 2-inch wide bias binding. And I need a new blade for my rotary cutter. It is not functioning at an efficient level. But now you can see I have a 2-inch strip, very stretchy, of bias binding. And I'm going to take that to the machine, to my iron, and fold it however I'm going to use it for an application purposes. I'm going to cut another piece so I can show you how to sew them together. All right, so I have my 2 pieces of bias binding and I want to make them into one long piece. So I'm going to sew them together, right sides together, and you can get a perfect angle if you line your pieces up. These are 2-inch wide pieces on the grid. And you're going to have tails. You have to lop those tails off. But I'm going to pin this together, right sides together. And I know, and I always check before I stitch, but I know that when I open this up, it's going to make one long piece, right? So I can just test that. Now, if you're a little nervous about sewing from this angle to this angle, just draw a line. It's, you know, it's bias binding. Use a pencil or something, or chalk, or something that isn't going to bleed through on your fabric. And now I have this line here, and I'm going to go stitch that, and I'll show you how that comes out. All right, here we are back again, and I've run a stitching along that line. I'm going to take this pin out. I don't need it anymore. And you can see that I have a beautiful line connecting my seams together. I have a piece of very stretchy bias binding. Now, obviously you don't want all of that tails there, and this is a seam, so we're just going to trim it to 1/4 inch and then press that to one side. And I still have little ears there. I'm just going to lop those off. We don't need them. You don't need all of that extra inside your binding. And now I have attached and grown my beautiful piece of bias binding, right? And you can press this open, you know, take it to the machine and press that diagonal seam open, so when you start folding this in half, you don't have like gobs and gobs of bulk underneath there. And it's that simple. Cut it, sew it, use it. You will love it. We cut our bias strips, and the width of these strips will be determined by how wide you want that neck edge to be, or whatever you happen to be binding. This piece is about 1 3/4 inches, and you can see it's very stretchy. The first thing you want to do is you want to iron it in half, right? So now you have wrong sides together, and you iron it in half. The next step for your bias binding, to make your bias binding, is to fold in the outside edges. So here we have this giraffe print, and I folded it in half. And the reason, there's a couple of reasons for putting that seam in there, but it's a marker for you. When you open this back up again, you fold the raw edges into the marker and then fold this in half. And what happens is your raw edges are concealed inside that bias tape. And now this will get sewn depending on the manner you want to sew it on. And again, you have lots of options. You can see it, it can be visible, it can be invisible, it can be inside of your garment, but this is a traditional way to make bias binding, right? And then if you're going to do a big project, you want to make miles and miles of bias binding. This was for a jacket that I made, and I did all the seams inside, so I made miles and miles of this. And you can see, again, I folded it in half, and then I folded the insides into the seam allowance, giving me this really nice tape. Now you can buy bias binding tape, and this is a black one that I purchased from the store. It has both sides folded in, and then I would fold this in half to make a really narrow bias binding. And again, that depends on how you're going to finish your garment. That's a project for another day. But suffices to say, this is also stretchy, but what happens is this is super soft, right? This is going to match your garment. This is stiff. There's no drape on this whatsoever. It will stand up. It almost stands up on its own. So if you put this on a lightweight knit fabric, it's going to make that fabric expand and stand out. It's not a good option. Not to mention the fact that, I mean, the colorways are marginal. If you're going to do something, you'd be better off to do it in its own fabric. By the time you go to the fabric store and buy this, you can have made miles and miles of this, or ordered it and wait for it to come in online. So a couple of examples of self-binding. This is the True Bias shirt. And on this shirt, I have done a self-bias binding. Isn't that cute? Right? So instead of, this is the True Bias Rio Ringer t-shirt. So instead of putting a ribbing on here, which they have on the pattern, they have this white contrasting ribbing. I made bias binding with this knit, and this is knit. I made bias binding with this knit and folded it over and stitched it on. Now, in contrast, I want to show you a LuLaRoe dress that has a self binding on the neck edge, and I want you to see that mine looks very similar to what is on the commercial garments that you're purchasing. So here is the neck edge to a LuLaRoe dress, self-binding. Same thing. This one happens to have a row of double stitching. I opted for a single needle stitch on this, but outside of that, they are essentially the same. So this looks like I purchased it in a store, not like it came out of my studio. And this is a purchased garment. They look fabulous together, right? So you can achieve this look very simply by making your own bias binding. It works for a knit garment. If you're going to finish off a woven garment with a binding, then you would still use bias binding, and it would help the woven stay put and pulled together. You're going to absolutely love making your own bias binding. Simple and easy, right? Here we have fold over elastic, and you can see it's shiny on one side, it's matte on the other. You can make your decision on which side you want to choose, but you can see that ridge in the middle. You literally fold it on that ridge to get your bias binding, and it's nice and stretchy. It's perfect. All right, so I hope you enjoyed this primer on bias binding. We have all kinds of options for you to choose from. You can go ahead and make your own and finish your garments beautifully. Next time we will explore how to apply the bias binding to your neck edge. So for now, happy sewing. Bye.